Well, it seems like the understatement of, well, anything to say that water is essential to our lives. Because, well, that's obvious. Without it, we would cease to exist. But rarely does the topic of water find its way onto the agendas of boardroom discussions. But as Alberta is expected to have its worst drought year on record since 2001, and given just how essential having a stable, clean, and sustainable water supply is, it's imperative for business leaders and policy makers to be talking about water management. Well, welcome to a special series of The Brief called Advancing Missions and Moonshots. I am your host, Brittany Brander, and in this series, I talk to leading experts, business leaders, innovators, and thought leaders across Alberta and Canada and explore solutions to the world's biggest challenges in energy, agriculture, and health. And today, I am joined by Vicki Lightbown, the director of the Water Innovation Program at Alberta Innovates, to talk about why innovation might be the key to long-term water and drought management in Alberta, and how we can harness the power of the technology, the knowledge, the best practices to protect our water resources and adapt to a changing water future. Welcome to the show, Vicki.
Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here.
So before we get into the meat of our conversation, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your work at Alberta Innovates?
Sure. As you mentioned, my name is Vicki Lightbown. I'm the director for the Water Innovation Program at Alberta Innovates. The Water Innovation Program was established to advance research and technology needed to get to the goals of Alberta's Water for Life strategy. And those goals are things like safe, secure drinking water, healthy aquatic ecosystems, and reliable quantity water supplies for sustainable economy. The program helps to build a foundation for good water management now into the future. Water really is fundamental to almost everything we do, as you said in the introduction. And I love that I can say my job is everything and anything water in Alberta.
Which is not something that we often say in marketing. It is not everything and anything. So we're here to talk about water and drought management based on a paper that you have written for the Business Council of Alberta on this topic. It's a really sobering thought, and this is a statistic that kind of stopped me in my tracks when I was reading it, that this year in Alberta is on track to be one of the worst drought years since 2001. You know, we're recording this at the beginning of the seeding season, and wildfire season is starting much earlier than it usually is. You know, I'm seeing reports come out of Fort McMurray and they're heartbreaking, year after year. And so before, we get into the solutions and how we can apply innovation, let's just try to understand the challenge maybe a little bit more. Can you give me a big picture of maybe the state of water and drought in the province and kind of the context around the challenges that we're seeing?
Sure. The saying that the only constant is change definitely applies here. The state of water in the province is always changing. As you mentioned, we had severe drought in 2001, then we had massive flooding in 2013, and now we're back to another severe drought this year. Depending where you are in the province, it feels the drought a bit differently. So in southern Alberta, the concern is about water supply. So low stream flows, low reservoir volumes. Communities and farmers are really worried about how are we going to have enough water to supply our community, to irrigate, to drink, to run business. In northern Alberta, the concern is more about dry conditions. So you mentioned wildfire and Fort McMurray already being under an evacuation order. So where you are really will impact how the drought is felt within the province. The impacts of climate change are really going to be felt through water, where, when, how we get it. It's expected that we'll see more of these extreme conditions going forward. So it's really important that we learn from the past and develop the right tools, prepare and respond going forward. We learned a lot from 2001, and the province is being proactive this year with water sharing agreements already in place.
Mm-hmm. So when we're faced with drought, sometimes the message to citizens is to do whatever they can to conserve water. Shorter showers, not running the tap when brushing the teeth, restrictions on, watering lawns. And those are great habits, but they're not necessarily going to move the needle in terms of drought management. Can you talk a little bit more about what drought management is and what it isn't?
Sure. So planners often talk about drought management or resiliency versus drought response. And so response is acting to something after it has happened, responding to the immediate issues and concerns. Drought management or resiliency is preparing in advance for a future scenario, and hopefully those impacts will be smaller. My colleague came up with a really good analogy. So in an emergency, say a house fire, there are firefighters who come to put it out. So that's the response. Management is building a better structure that's less likely to catch fire or limit the spread. It's having the tools ready for the firefighters so that they can be more effective at their job. And that's really where innovation comes in. We need new ideas and technologies to create these resilient structures and practices.
Yeah, something that is not talked about so much in our discussions on climate change. We are talking a lot about response and long-term planning, but we're not necessarily talking about adaptation. So those midterm strategies to make our communities more resilient to changing climate patterns. And that is actually an interesting point that you bring up in the paper, that actually help us make innovation can make us more resilient in the face of a crisis. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you're seeing in terms of the applicability of innovation? And as you described, it's the knowledge, the best practices, the technologies, to make us a little bit more resilient and better to respond in a crisis, but also mitigate long term and plan for the long term changing patterns of climate.
Yeah, absolutely. So to be resilient, you really need to understand the crisis first. So what is it going to look like? In this case of water, how severe will the drought be? How long is it going to last? In a flood, where is the flood water going to go? So it's important that we gather the right data and the right information to understand that. So researchers are developing models. They're gathering the data to better understand our water systems in Alberta. How is the surface water and groundwater going to interact? If we use surface water, how does that impact the water under the ground? And then predict what our stream flows might look like under different future climate change scenarios. If it's a dry year, a wet year, how we use the land, how does that impact the water flows? You can take this information, model future stream water flows, and then that can be used by decision makers to build in the resiliency. So we can manage our droughts for more than power generation. Manage our dams for more than power generation. We can hold back earlier meltwater so that we can release it more slowly through the summer when it might be drier. Or we can change the location of our water intakes if we better understand where the forecasted lows might be in a severe drought, so that we always have access to our water supply. So there's a few examples there. And then once you understand the future scenarios, then you need tools to adapt or mitigate. So if we expect our normal sources of water to be limited, we need to find alternative supplies, or we need ways of operating with less water. New water treatment technologies are enabling industry like agriculture, oil and gas to use less water and recycle more within their processes.
But can you talk a little bit about just some of the solutions that Alberta Innovates has been a part of in terms of moving some of these innovations forward?
Yeah, there's a few great examples. So I'll try and highlight a couple. One would be in irrigation. So there's a company called Itelarain that they've been developing a novel irrigation technology for farmers. So putting sensors in the field to better understand wet and dry spaces, and then better managing through software where the water is applied specifically on the field, so that the wet spots get less water and the dry spots get a little bit more. So overall, the farmer's using less water and are using it more efficiently, and already seeing improved crop growth on the fields that are using this technology. Another one would be stormwater. So stormwater is an alternative water supply for us, but it's not always the cleanest. It has things that run off our streets. It has birds and animals that live in it. And so how can we have a more effective treatment? And so we supported a company called Source to Source, who's developed a natural wet stormwater pond system that better treats the water, so at the back end, it is met the requirements for irrigation on sports fields within the city of Calgary.
So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing that are standing in the way of really capitalizing on these innovations?
Innovation is really only effective if it's adopted. And so adoption of innovation can be slowed by things like regulatory approvals, public perception, and the cost of change. A new way of operating might not have been allowed under existing regulations, often not intentionally, but because the new way wasn't feasible or wasn't even thought about when the regulation was made originally. Public perception can slow the adoption because the public may not yet be comfortable or trust the new technology or process, and they need time to be shown that it works and works reliably. A good example is water reuse. So taking municipal wastewater, so things that go down the toilet, and directly drinking that, treating it so it's safe, but there's an ick factor that's associated with that. Like, I don't want to drink that water, even though it's gone through multiple barriers to protect the public. Village Brewery and the Advancing Canadian Water Assets, so it's a University of Calgary research lab, they joined together to do a trial beer run where they took treated wastewater from City of Calgary and ran it through a production run for Village Brewery and produced a beer from it. And a lot of people hesitate when they want to drink that beer because they say, oh, where did this come from? So it's hard to get over those perceptions about different new technology and a new way of doing things. And then finally, it does take money to develop, test, and implement new technology. It's not for free. It can be hard to justify that cost within an industry that has narrow margins. Water benefits can also be hard to quantify in a standard cost revenue accounting framework. And so we really need to to understand and help justify those costs for businesses to pull the trigger on saying, well, we'll do things differently when it comes to water within our business.
Right. I want to pull on that last point that you just made. So you make a point in the paper that water management is not necessarily a core business activity and is often deferred to things like increased production, especially when business leaders are looking at where to allocate their capital and their investment. So my question is, what case would you make to a business leader to help them really understand how essential this activity is to their business and why they should invest in water management best practices, technologies, innovations, et cetera?
So I think in the big picture, business leaders do understand how essential water management is, but it's easy to defer when water has historically been available in enough quantities and at low cost. So what we need is a new way to account for and cost out these benefits of improved water management, while at the same time lowering the cost of new technology and processes. So innovate faster, innovate cheaper, innovate better, take advantage of government funding programs like what we have. Things like water certification could help in some sectors. So similar to an Energy Star program or certified organic. It helps bring water more into core business and enables consumers to drive the need for water efficiency as well.
Right. So you mentioned certification. Is there any other policy changes that you think, maybe municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments could do to move the needle on those innovative approaches to water management?
Yeah, so regulations are in place to protect, and very rightly, it takes time for them to change. We don't want to create a new issue by addressing the current one. Many regulatory bodies are looking to support innovation and new practices and are working with industry and environment experts to make sure that it is done safely and efficiently. As an example where regulatory change could move the needle is in oil and gas process water management. So currently processed water from oil and gas can only go to deep well disposal. So it goes deep underground, we never really see it again. This protects our surface water, but it also puts all processed water into one bucket. It all has to be sent underground eventually. There are different water streams, though, in production. Some is really just simply salty water that comes up from the ground with the oil and gas. It's relatively clean and relatively easy to treat. So changing disposal requirements for different categories of processed water could potentially open up new sources of water for use outside of oil and gas while still protecting the environment.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask you to think about this a little bit broader too. If we get the policy environment right on these innovations, the investments right, both from the public and private side, what does Alberta stand to gain? Like, what is the vision? If we can apply innovation to our water management, what is the opportunity for Alberta?
So the easiest answer is resiliency. So things are changing. As I mentioned before, we're going to feel climate change through water. And so if we are more resilient to that change, then we'll have a bit more of a stable economy, stable communities. Alberta is already benefiting from changes to policy that have resulted from research and innovation. As an example, in 2021, Alberta issued guidelines for water reuse and stormwater reuse. These guidelines were partially informed by research at the U of A that developed a quantitative risk assessment framework to help limit exposure to pathogens in different use cases. Then in 2023, there was a regulatory amendment that allowed water to be diverted from stormwater pond without a license if certain conditions are met. So these changes are happening. As we've already discussed, it can be slow. If we go too slow, we could restrict our ability to be resilient, to gain that resilient future. But if we go too fast, we might create unintended consequences. So it's a bit of a fine line to walk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my next question was, flipping that. What do we risk if we don't move fast enough or develop the right kind of policies? And I think you touched on a little bit there that we will lose our ability to be resilient in the face of a crisis.
Yeah, that's right. I think we do have some policies and regulations already in place that help us, but we could be limited if we're not moving forward to try and do things better or create that resilient future. But again, as I mentioned, if we do go too fast, there's risks to that as well. So it is finding that balance.
Right. So my last question for you is this. What is one insight that you would like people to take away from this paper?
Water is really personal. Everyone has a right to water, and so everyone has a responsibility to ensure that we're using it efficiently and effectively as possible. The best way to do that is understand our water needs now into the future and to develop solutions to ensure that these needs are met.
Well, thank you for tuning into this special episode of The Brief. You can read Vicki Lightbown's paper in its entirety at definethedecade.com. We will be releasing new episodes in this series periodically, so make sure that you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts to be among the first to access new episodes. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.